Hi, everyone. It's about 12 noon, so we'll get started here. I just want to thank everybody for joining us today for the NAEMSE webinar. Today we have Dr. Patterson from the University of Pittsburgh. Dr. Patterson?
Yes, thanks for the opportunity to speak to everybody. Appreciate the time. The topic of today's presentation is obviously fatigue risk management, as the title slide there implies. A couple of disclosures. My employment is with the University of Pittsburgh. I do work part-time as a paramedic. Actually, I did a shift last night, so I'm a little bit fatigued this morning. So current support is contracts through NHTSA. Quick outline of the presentation, and for those of you who are watching or in attendance who have seen some of this, have seen me present recently on some of this material, you may recognize some of the materials and some of the slides, and so forgive the duplication or repetition if you have seen this information before. However, there is some additional information towards the end that I think you might find interesting. And please also ask questions. We've had, approximately 6 months or so to ruminate on the recommendations that came out in January from this project, and there are some, perceptions and some angles and some questions that we can address now more comprehensively than we probably could 6 months ago. So please feel free at the end here to ask some questions. And as the outline suggests, we're going to, just talk about fatigue in general, define it, talk about different stages of sleep. So give you some more of the biology of sleep, so that you have a good frame of reference of why sleep is so important, and tell you more about what we know and don't know about fatigue and EMS, and then go over the guidelines, the recommendations that resulted from this massive project funded by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration to develop some guidelines focused on fatigue risk management in EMS, specifically in EMS. And again, at the end, have some time for questions. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the popular news outlets and media outlets in EMS, EMS1, GEMS, EMS World, all these other ones. And probably a month doesn't go by that I can't go to one of these resources and pull out some sort of headline that suggests fatigue or sleep deprivation was a factor in some sort of problem. Typically an ambulance accident, but not always. So, using those media stories as a barometer of problem magnitude, it's suggestive that fatigue is a problem industry-wide. And some of you may have seen me deliver or present this video before, and I'm hoping this actually works via the webinar. It has before. I hope it works this time as well. But here's a really short video that I compiled of just a few of the snippets of some media-focused attention on specific fatigue-related and sleep deprivation-related events in EMS. And I think it really further implies that fatigue is a problem in our industry.
They found that a second camera recorded what was going on inside the cab. Watch as the driver falls asleep at the wheel, only to be startled awake when he veers off the road and hits the sports car.
What we came to find out is that this driver was on the 24th hour of a 24-hour shift straight without any breaks.
An ambulance driver involved in last week's fatal accident turned herself into a breeze at the Floyd County Jail. 21-year-old Kristen Keys is charged with vehicular homicide, second-degree, and failure to maintain a lane.
The accident killed 55-year-old Patterson. They say that she was crashing into two trees and flipping them. Steve Jefferson explains why police believe the ambulance driver is the one who caused the crash. Paramedic Yusuf Japan did not survive what I think the early morning crash while riding in the back of his ambulance. It happened here at US 31 and State Road 218 around 3:45 a.m. Monday, where Indiana State troopers spent the day deconstructing the crash. This is where troopers say 26-year-old ambulance driver Christine Wessner fell asleep.
Now I'm hoping that everybody was able to hear that, and I really want to. I use these video pieces of video from different news outlets, again, to reinforce the point that fatigue and sleep deprivation are problems not isolated to one type of EMS system or part of the country. You can see that a lot of these came from different parts of the country. One came from California, one came from Georgia, Tennessee area, the other one came from Indiana. So this is, you know, in my opinion, a widespread problem. I think many of you can relate to that. So when we say fatigue, what do we actually mean? Fatigue is really, the Cliff Note version, is an overwhelming feeling of tiredness and exhaustion. Really, most people think of it as a manifestation of physical symptoms. You can have mental fatigue. You know, a lot of folks refer to that as burnout or just mental exhaustion. And you may not have signs and symptoms of physical fatigue symptoms like muscle soreness, etc. But it's either mental or physical exhaustion. You don't have to be sleep deprived to feel fatigue. However, those two, sleep deprivation and fatigue, are highly, highly correlated. What do we mean when we say sleepiness? Well, the sleep literature and the sleep scientists draw a clear division, a dividing line, a separation between sleepiness and fatigue. Because you can be sleepy, and that can be normal at certain times of the day, which I'm going to talk about in the next few slides, is that we all feel this tendency to be sleepy and fall asleep or nod off at certain times of the day, and that's natural. That's natural circadian biology. However, the propensity to fall asleep can be magnified if we are deprived of sleep and feeling fatigued as well. So again, the sleepiness, according to the sleep scientists, is a different concept than the concept of fatigue. They separate the two, but they are actually highly correlated. So what is sleep? Here is the textbook definition of sleep. And I'm just going to pick out some key terms here just so that you kind of have a frame of reference. Postural recumbence, thus lying down or lying back. Semi-Fowler's, I'm sure, is probably appropriate for some people. Behavioral quiescence, so basically being quiet behaviorally. Closed eyes, not always the case, but some people sleep with their eyes open. I've learned in watching some colleagues and collaborators. And then the other signs and symptoms associated with sleeping. I think we're all nodding our heads, and when we look at this definition, those things make sense. So that's the textbook definition of sleep. How does sleep and alertness actually work, and what controls it? Well, the central core, or the nucleus of sleep in our brain, is located in the hypothalamus and the suprachiasmatic nuclei of the hypothalamus. And one of the external factors that sort of stimulates the SCN in terms of circadian rhythms is exposure to light, as this graphic kind of shows you. So again, the SCN, the suprachiasmatic nuclei, and the hypothalamus is sort of the central control group for our sleep patterns and sleep behavior, our circadian biology. This graph is a commonly used graph to talk about the pressure to sleep during the day over a 24-hour period, the periods when we have higher levels of alertness. And what I want to point out here in terms of how to read this graphic is that those arrows coming from the top part of the slide, going downwards, is what we call process S. So that's the sleep homeostatic drive, the pressure to go to sleep. And that pressure to go to sleep actually builds and starts to build as soon as you wake up in the morning. As soon as you wake up in the morning, the pressure to go back to sleep just starts immediately. And it builds and builds and builds, and then goes up and down over the course of a 24-hour period, as the graphic implies. And it competes against process C, which is our circadian biology, our circadian rhythms. And according to these two processes, or the way to interpret how we battle between the urge to go to sleep and our drive for alertness, is illustrated really in that dark line in the middle of the graph. That's the alertness level. Our alertness starts to climb as we wake up. It takes a while for us to become alert. And then it takes a little bit of a dip in the afternoon. Many folks equate that to having a big lunch or having a big meal, and then the need to fall asleep in the early afternoon. You don't necessarily have to have a big meal or even eat to feel that pressure to sleep and loss of alertness in the early afternoon. It is actually not completely tied to just eating. It's a natural process, and our alertness drops a little bit in the early afternoon. There are fluctuations in body temperature and other hormones that sort of coincide with this up and down process that I'll talk about here shortly. And what's interesting is that our alertness then gets a second level of, it gets a jump, you see a boost, and you can see that boost sort of in the middle of that graphic, where the tallest up arrow coming from the bottom of the graph underneath the pitch in the line going in the middle is approximately around 9 p.m. Some of the sleep scientists refer to the period from 5 p.m. to like 2,300 hours as the forbidden zone in terms of sleeping or trying to take a nap. If you can get a nap if you had the opportunity to take a nap and you wanted to time your nap appropriately with your circadian biology, try to get that nap in the early afternoon. Don't try to go to sleep unless you have a huge sleep debt between 5 and 11 p.m. because you're going to have a hard time doing that, because your alertness level goes back up at that time period, and also your body temperature rises at its peak around 5 p.m. So you have some factors going against you when trying to take a nap in the later evening hours. But anyway, this graphic is a commonly used graphic to show the competition between the pressure to go to sleep and our natural approximately 24-hour circadian biology and fluctuations in alertness. Stages of sleep. We go through multiple stages of sleep, and this is just one graphic that sort of illustrates that. We typically go through 4 stages of sleep. Stage 1 is a very short-lived period where the triggers to alert you and get you to wake up are very minimal. However, when you get into the deeper stage of sleep, it's a little more difficult to wake you. And we also go through what we call REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, where we dream. And what you can notice from this graphic is that the thickness of that REM period expands as the period of our sleep goes into 6, 7, 8 hours of total sleep time. It's a very short-lived period early in our period of sleep. And we actually go into the deeper stages of sleep, those very important deep stages of sleep, early in the sleep period. And those are very valuable time periods in our sleep course. Here's another graphic, and the whole point in putting this up there is to just show you that the illustration of the ups and downs through the sleep stages can be illustrated differently depending on what graph you look at. REM, which is illustrated here in that little red at the very bottom, is just illustrated in a different way than other graphics. So the whole point here in showing you these different graphics is that we do go through different stages of sleep. We go up and down approximately every 90 minutes. REM is a small proportion of that sleep period early in our sleep hours, but as we progress into the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th hour, rapid eye movement, dream type sleep expands. This is a graphic of sleep latency. This is sort of that first stage of sleep. So when you lie your head down on a pillow or whatever you lie your head down on, it takes the average adult approximately 10 to 11 minutes to fall asleep, and that's called sleep latency. If, for some reason, you lay your head down and all of a sudden you're almost immediately asleep, you either have a huge sleep debt where you've been deprived of sleep for some time, like 24 hours, for example, or you potentially have some sort of medical condition like narcolepsy, maybe you have sleep apnea, or some other condition. And you can see through the graph that if you have on average about 6 hours time in bed over a period of 4 nights, your sleep latency is going to be a lot shorter than if you have on average 8 hours of time in bed. A little bit more about the stages of sleep. Stage 1 again is marked by you nodding your head, I'm sure many of us are familiar with those myoclonic jerks when you're either on a plane or in a car riding as a passenger, and all of a sudden you just have that jerking motion. That's stage 1 sleep. And those are usually embarrassing episodes. Stage 2 is a very, again, short-lived stage. It takes a little bit more of a stimulus to wake you when you get into stage 2, but that immediately follows stage 1. Stage 3 and 4 are the deeper stages of sleep, as I mentioned before. These are very important stages of sleep because this is when our body starts to repair itself, repairs muscle, damaged muscles, tissues, etc. Growth hormones are stimulated, immune function is enhanced. If you try to wake someone out of the stage 3 and 4 sleep cycle, they feel very, very groggy, and sleep inertia is a major, major problem. And I'm sure many of you, and this has happened to me in the past, if you've been on duty and you are allowed to sleep and you get toned out during stage 3 and 4 sleep, you are almost incapacitated for a period of time because you have been awoken from that really deep stage sleep. And that, if you do remember that from your previous experience in EMS, you were probably in stage 3-4 sleep. REM sleep, again, is the dreaming sleep, and again, it expands as we are sleeping longer. Okay, some other cool or neat functions about our sleep cycles is that body temperature fluctuates. It's at its lowest point in the early morning hours, around 1:30 a.m. to 3 a.m. Drop a full degree Celsius. And then it's at its peak around 5 p.m., around 1700 hours, and it rises a full degree Celsius. Cortisol fluctuates a little bit. Melatonin is at its peak in the late evening, 0:00 hours, midnight, and then dissipates and lessens around 0500, 0600, 0700, and reduces during the daytime. Again, here's another illustration of that that battle between the sleep drive and our circadian biology. A key factor here, external factor, is the sun, exposure to light. If you've been working on a 24-hour shift and you get off around 6 a.m., 7 a.m., you may be completely sleep deprived and you need sleep. However, you get that traditional boost in alertness. No matter how much sleep you've been deprived of, you'll still get a little bit of a boost early in the morning because it's our natural circadian biology. You've been exposed potentially to light. Doesn't mean you get the best boost or you get the optimal boost as if you were fully rested, but you will still get a little bit of a boost in terms of alertness but through exposure of light, excuse me, and based off our natural circadian biology. If for some reason you have to work and stay up around approximately 24 hours, you can see through this illustration here that the pressure to sleep just builds and builds and builds and builds. It continues to build. And again, if you've been awake for that long period of time and you so happen to not go to sleep in the early morning hours, approximately 6 a.m., 7 a.m., 8 a.m., you will experience a little bit of that boost in terms of alertness, which is natural. The National Sleep Foundation recommends between 7 and 9 hours of sleep for most adults. And you can see here that it could potentially be appropriate to get around 6 hours of sleep because you've become acclimated to that. If you sleep longer than 10 hours, then there's typically some sort of comorbidity associated with that, or you're really, really sleep deprived. But on a regular basis, if you're sleeping more than 10 hours per night, there's typically some sort of comorbidity with that. Most adults report 7 hours of sleep per night, so that most U.S. adults are getting, at least the minimum of what the National Sleep Foundation recommends. Insufficient sleep is therefore defined as less than 7 hours per night. Poor sleep, the insufficient sleep or poor sleep affects approximately 1/3 of U.S. adults, regardless of the type of work they do. What about the impacts? Well, this graphic shows two things. On the left side is PVT lapses. So PVT is a standard performance measure test. And on the right-hand side of the illustration, you see subjective sleepiness. So how sleepy do you feel? Each of those lines in the graph on the left and right illustrate the results from either the PVT test or the subjective sleepiness score based off of different times in bed over a 14-day period. So there was a group of people who stayed in bed for 8 hours. That's the bottom green line you see on both of the graphs. You can see this is kind of flat, and that based off of the graphic on the left, the number of lapses is quite low compared to the other lines. The next line up is 6 hours time in bed. So if you spent 6 hours time in bed over a 14-day period, you start to increase the number of lapses. Your performance decays over a period of 14 days. And I'm sure many of you are thinking, well, I spend about 6 hours time in bed, so that's probably me. 4 hours time in bed, it looks worse. And then again, if somebody is completely sleep deprived over a long period of time, like that many number of days, their performance is completely horrible. And then if you look on the right side of the screen, you can see the subjective sleepiness. What's really interesting here is that while you see sort of a division on the left side graph between the 4 hours time in bed and the 6 hours time in bed in terms of the performance on PVT lapses, you can see how tight those two bars are on the right-hand side. So what that really suggests is that those who have 4 hours time in bed are perceiving their sleepiness similarly to those with 6 hours time in bed. However, their performance is much worse. So that's an interesting little tidbit there. Many of you may have heard someone say that, oh yeah, there's research out there that says, you know, if you're awake for 24 hours or more, it's the same as being intoxicated. And this is just an illustration, or this slide is devoted to that research led by Dawson and colleagues down in Australia. And there have been multiple studies that have looked at that, and they do equate legal intoxication, 0.08, for example, in terms of blood alcohol level, to the performance level on those who are completely sleep deprived over a 24 or 25 hour period. So it is analogous in terms of your performance on specific performance measures. What about other impacts, like on your health? Well, we know that with just one 24-hour period of sleep deprivation, and actually sleep deprivation in terms of only 4 hours time in bed, so actually getting some sleep, it can throw your insulin glucose balance off. So your liver has a little bit of a challenge here in terms of functioning normally with just a little bit of sleep deprivation. There's also some interference with your cardiovascular system. We have a natural dip in our blood pressure between 10 and 20% during nocturnal hours. So overnight, our blood pressure and our heart rate drop naturally. If you stay awake and you're working in shifts, you prevent, in many cases, that dipping, that nocturnal dip in blood pressure and heart rate. That blunting of that dip is an independent predictor of cardiovascular disease and other cardiovascular related acute events. So that's a huge concern. We're also more defensive. Our trust in our colleagues, our partners, those around us decays a little bit when we get deprived of sleep, and our emotions tend to take over, potentially become short-fused. There's also an impact on work-related injuries. This data comes from the National Health Interview Survey, thousands of people interviewed for this. And as you can see from this graphic, the less sleep you get per night, the higher your adjusted odds of being injured at work. Okay, so what do we know about fatigue and sleep in EMS? We know that approximately half, and actually greater than half, of EMS personnel report severe mental and physical fatigue while at work. We also know that fatigue levels increase over the course of a shift, and if we work 24-hour shift, they fluctuate a little bit. And you can see from the far right side here of that graphic, the one that says greater than 12 hours, fatigue increases and then it kind of goes back down or lessens right at 24-hour shift. Recall what I said about getting that little boost in alertness in the early morning hours due to the circadian biology. This data actually validates that circadian pattern very nicely. So fatigue, as these graphics, will increase over the course of a shift. And then if you work 24-hour shifts, for example, it does go up and down in a curvilinear fashion that maps our circadian biology. Half of EMS personnel report less than 6 hours of sleep per night. Greater than half report poor sleep quality. Half report not getting the recovery that they need between shifts. Many folks in EMS work long hours, long duration shifts, 12s, 24s, 48s, for example. Some even work a lot longer than that. In some locations, but 80%, greater than 80% work multiple jobs. And I can tell you that I know a lot of folks, especially my colleagues who I work with, many of them have multiple jobs out of necessity. And many of them work a lot of overtime hours as well. So that you can see there's a confluence of factors here that really make the fatigue problem a real reality. And we also know from this one study that you need to see a lot fewer of these long duration shifts, like greater than 16 hours, approximately 24 hours, before you observe an injury to your crew. You need to see many, many, many more of the 8-hour, 12-hour shifts before you see an injury. So the shift duration does have an impact. And we also know that those who self-report fatigue are at much greater odds of being injured on the job and having a medical or adverse event or doing things that compromise their safety. So with that as the background, NHTSA decided to fund a project for NAEMSE, the National Association of State EMS Officials, with me as the PI, to develop evidence-based guidelines. This actually stems from a 2013 advisory from the National EMS Advisory Council. The project to develop the guidelines was funded in 2015, and the guidelines were released or published just in January, and this is what I'm going to talk about. Here's sort of the logo. Some of you may be able to, or maybe you've already gone to this website and sort of browsed around a little bit, emsfatigue.org. This is a 3-phased project. We're currently in phase 2. We're gearing up for phase 2. We just completed phase 1, which is what I'm going to talk about. And then phase 3 is a partnership with a contractor organization who knows how to develop biomathematical models. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. All right, guidelines. What are guidelines? I'm sure many of you in the education domain are familiar with a lot of these clinical evidence-based guidelines that have been coming out in the past 5 to 10 years regarding different aspects of clinical care, like the use of benzos, for example, or other certain types of approaches to trauma patients, for example. There have been a number of guidelines or recommendations based off of evidence reviews that have sort of populated the EMS literature in the past 5 or 10 years. What's unique about what we are doing is that ours is one of the first to address an operational issue, not necessarily a clinical issue. The process is very time-consuming, but very important that you know how a guideline or recommendation is developed. In the upper left-hand slide, you can see this thing called PICO, which is the acronym for Population Intervention Comparison Outcome. And those are the elements of a research question. A group of investigators and panelists come together, which is what we did, and we developed a number of PICO questions, 7 to be exact, that would guide our evidence review. We then looked at the literature, which is sort of in the middle part of that upper graph there, and summarized what was relevant to each question into tables. On the far right side of the graph, you see things like risk of bias, inconsistency, indirectness, imprecision, publication bias, etc. Those are elements of risk of bias and quality assessment of the evidence. We went through that process. And then as you sort of progress down from the right side of that graph to the bottom part of that graph, still on the right side, you see the arrows heading to the panel. We presented the assessment of the quality of this evidence to the expert panel, and then the expert panel decided to debate the quality of the evidence in addition to considering things like the benefits and harms of a particular intervention. Say, for example, napping on duty. What are the benefits and harms associated with napping on duty? What are the values and preferences of the target population regarding napping on duty, for example? And what does it cost? After the panel considers all of those elements, which includes the quality of the evidence, They then decide whether or not they're going to issue a recommendation. If they do decide to issue a recommendation, they will attach a strength of evidence on the recommendation as either strong or weak in terms of the recommendation. And that's the process in a nutshell of developing a guideline and developing individual recommendations. We reviewed more than 38,000 pieces of literature as a part of this project to come up with the guidelines. There were over 7 questions. Recommendation number 1. The panel recommends that EMS personnel receive education and training to mitigate fatigue and fatigue-related risk. And I think this is obviously the one that's most relevant to this group. This group, if they decide to act on this recommendation from the expert panel, will need to debate how would that be possible, how will that be developed in the formative education phase of paramedics and EMTs and other first responders. How are we going to educate and train personnel to mitigate fatigue and fatigue-related risk in that setting? Some elements that should be focused on, things like the hazards of fatigue, basic sleep physiology like I went over earlier, sleep disorders, fatigue recognition, alertness strategies, etc. So these are some elements that have been recommended in general for all types of shift worker occupations. The goal the panel set would be that you have 100% of EMS crew members, obviously those who are working in the field, who are educated and trained at baseline, so when they come into the organization, and then again every 2 years. So think about it like a PALS or ACLS renewal, is that you want to renew their education and training, because as the literature on ACLS and PALS shows, our memories and our skills decay. So we need to rehash it. The panel also recommends that EMS personnel have the opportunity to nap while on duty. Is this revolutionary? Is this controversial? It very much so is controversial and revolutionary for some systems. Some systems, and I've worked in systems where there was a very clear and strict policy that prevented you from napping, sleeping on duty, and I actually fired people for that. So in some systems, napping on duty is a revolutionary concept. For other systems, it's not so much. How might an organization, an EMS agency, structure a nap? And this might be something also to talk about as a part of the education and training in the formative stages. Shorter may be better due to sleep inertia, and as I mentioned to you earlier, that when you get into that deeper stage sleep, the stage 3 and 4 sleep, if you are awoken, number 1, it takes a huge stimulus to get you out of stage 3 and 4 sleep. Number 2, if you are awoken out of stage 3 and 4 sleep, the sleep inertia is significant. And some of the literature suggests that it takes you 30 minutes after you are even after you had an 8-hour period of sleep, it can take you 30 minutes to get up to a level of alertness of someone who is fully awake. So we need to be very cognizant of the fact that if we do allow napping and we do have a sleep policy that promotes sleeping on duty, that sleep inertia is a threat. And there is some literature that suggests that shorter is better. However, there's still a huge debate out there in the literature as to whether or not we should let folks sleep longer so that they get the sleep that they need and that they are not continuing to be sleep deprived due to the shift work. One idea is maybe to have one crew member who sleeps at a time, especially if you do dynamic deployment or system status management. And I've been in that situation where I was sitting in the passenger seat and it's 3 a.m. and I ran out of my coffee, my provisions, and the convenience store that we're posting at is closed, or we're posted on some rural road and there's no access to caffeine. Maybe in that kind of situation, it would be permissible to have the crew member who is in the passenger seat sleeping while the other person is awake and capable of immediately operating the ambulance if toned out. So that's just one option. Another thing to think about is rest is not the same as napping. Sleeping here is the key, and it's important. Rest does not imply and potentially could be used against the crew members in terms of allowing them to sleep. Saying rest as a policy does not clearly state sleeping. So we need to make sure that we use our phrases and our words appropriately to reference what we allow crews to do. The panel said or recommended that EMS crew members have permission and opportunity to nap. Okay, so they may have permission, but in some systems they may not have the opportunity. So they combine that to say that they not only need the permission, but they also need the opportunity. And the panel obviously recognized that those who work extended shifts, like those greater than equal to 12 hours, and those that are overnight, could benefit most from napping on duty. Caffeine. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with coffee and other forms of caffeine, and it's very popular in the EMS industry. And you are probably encouraged to know that the evidence showed that caffeine is in fact beneficial. And the panel digested that and then recommended that, yes, caffeine should be a part of a fatigue countermeasure, and that there is enough evidence behind the use of this stimulant to support its use in the EMS setting. And the panel therefore recommended that EMS workers have access to caffeine. The key here is access. You can't force anyone to consume caffeine, but you can provide access to it. And access is actually very important because in some systems, they don't provide caffeine or access to caffeine. And it is more difficult to provide access to caffeine, especially in those systems where they do dynamic deployment and crews are often deployed in the trucks, posting on the street corners, for example. Those, again, posting on street corners or on rural roads at night may have limited access and therefore may be the ones who are most vulnerable and the ones in most need of this kind of countermeasure. It is expensive. One system that I work with in terms of research and collaboration, they divulged they spent over $30,000 in a year on providing caffeine to base sites. And one year they took it away because they were trying to find money-saving opportunities in the budget. There was obviously some pushback on that from the crew members, and given the evidence that came from this evidence review, they then reinstated the caffeine, access to caffeine, which the crew members were very happy with. But the point here is that while the panel recommends providing access to it, there is no recommended standard for how you provide access. It's just that you provide access to it. You don't necessarily have to pay for it, as is explained in the documents that accompany this work. But being able to provide access to caffeine is an important thing. However, if you do decide to pay for it, it can be, in some cases, expensive. The panel recommends 100% of shifts have access to caffeine, as I just mentioned earlier. Now, one of the controversial recommendations or focus areas for this project was shift duration. The panel and the research team did not go into this project focusing on 24-hour shifts, just to put that out there. 24-hour shifts, however, were shown in the literature to be somewhat harmful in terms of outcomes than were shifts that were less than 24 hours in duration. What was really interesting about this focus area was that this one had the most literature that we had to review. We reviewed more than 21,000 pieces of literature focused on shift duration. Only 100 out of the 24 actually reported outcomes stratified by 2 shift durations or more. So an 8 versus 12-hour shift, for example, or a 12 versus 24-hour shift. There's a lot of literature out there that you may, on the surface, think address this shift duration, but when you start to dig a little deeper, you come to find out that, in fact, they do not present outcomes stratified by one shift duration versus the other. 25 of these 100 were experimental studies, 75 were observational, and just, oh, by the way, we went all the way back to 1980. So from 1980 to 2016, the end of 16, only 100 actually stratified by shift duration. There were all types of shift workers that were, in terms of the populations studied that we reviewed. There were 24 different comparisons of shift duration in this literature that we assembled. 38 compared 8-hour versus 12-hour shift, and most of that was with nurses. There were 38 that compared multiple shift durations. So for example, 10 versus 12 versus 14-hour shifts. So more than 2 shift durations. And then there were 24 that compared 2 shift durations, such as 12s versus 24s. We isolated our focus on 15 studies that compared approximately 24 hours or less. And here's the reason why. This is a grid. I don't want you to actually try to read this, but I want you to pay attention to a few key things. One is the columns are stratified by the outcomes that we looked at. Safety outcomes, fatigue outcomes, sleep health outcomes, retention, turnover, long-term health, burnout, stress, and cost. The rows are the actual individual studies. And you can see on the far left column where they fall in terms of what comparisons were made. Well, and we did this with every single study that was included, all 100. And we were looking for favorability towards the shorter or longer shift duration to give us some clues in terms of pattern. What we noticed when we looked at this grid that looked at approximately 24 hours versus less is that there was a dominant pattern of 16 to 1. 16 outcomes favorable towards the shorter shift duration versus 1 towards the longer shift duration. We did not see that pattern at all in the other comparisons, 8 versus 12s or multiple comparisons. And one of the sleep scientists actually saw this pattern during our review and made note of it, which isolated our focus on 24s versus less than 24 hours as a part of the recommendation. So with that dominant pattern, the recommendation that the panel came up with was obvious. They had to focus on the 24 versus less given what the data showed us. And I get frequently questions about is there any data out there on these 48-hour or 72-hour shifts? Because there seems to be a lot of organizations, especially out west, that are starting to go to more of the longer duration shifts out of convenience, out of a cost, or other reasons, or a preference of the crew members. And I'm happy to report, but also sad to report that there are only 2 studies since 1980, published studies that actually looked at any outcome at all, stratifying that included a 48-hour shift or less, or 48-hour shift or longer. And the quality of evidence is quite low. And sadly, what this means is that we don't have enough information to refute these really, really long duration shifts. And we also don't have enough information to support their utility for any outcome of interest. So we have a really sparse amount of information regarding super long duration shifts. One of the things that we discuss is that if you are in the position to develop fatigue risk management programs, that you avoid the temptation to make your program's focus shift duration. If you focus solely on shift duration or make the highlight of your fatigue risk management program shift duration, you're probably going to lose the battle against fatigue mitigation or mitigating fatigue. Because as others have shown us who have worked in other industries, rail, aviation, transportation, long-haul trucking, for example, you can lose the battle before you even fight the first, you can lose the war before you even fight the first battle, because the perception among those who you are trying to impact is that you're trying to take away from their livelihood. So if you want to make shift duration a part of your recipe for fatigue risk management, that's great. Here's the evidence that says this shifts longer than 24 hours can jeopardize safety, can jeopardize other outcomes. Shifts less are more positive. However, if you choose not to address shift duration and use other elements as a part of your fatigue risk management program, great. There's evidence to support those other strategies. However, we caution, and the panel cautions against focusing solely on shift duration because you potentially can lose the war before you even start the first battle, based solely on perception of what that means for the crew members. If you choose to focus on shift duration or make it a part of the equation, The panel recommends 100% of all shifts less than 24 hours in duration. However, in some locations that may not be possible. The panel also recommends that if you're going to develop a fatigue risk management program, you need to, number one, assess fatigue so you know how big or how small the problem is. And they recommend that you use an instrument that has shown some reliability and or validity with shift workers. Don't simply go to Google, type in fatigue survey, and use whatever shows up on the top 10 searches, because you potentially are using a tool that has not been tested adequately and has not been shown to have adequate or appropriate reliability and or validity. We discovered 14 instruments that are adequate, have reported adequate reliability and or validity with shift worker groups, not just EMS, but other shift worker groups. And here's a list of those acronyms. And the publication actually provides the survey instrument and how to score it in full for some of these in the appendix of that publication, which is referenced in the far right lower column page of this slide. And it is also available on emsfatigue.org for free in the Appendix E section. So some of these instruments you can look at in total, in whole, and know how to score them and use them. For some of them, the developers would not give us permission to reprint them. So if you do decide to assess fatigue, use a tool that has shown reliability and or validity with shift worker groups, and here they are. The goal, according to the panel, is to assess fatigue and sleepiness at least once every quarter. And let me conclude so we have some time for some questions. As I've mentioned before when I've given this presentation, that EMS should be proud as a profession, as an industry. No other high-risk occupation that works or deploys crew members in shifts, such as aviation, shipping, rail, other transportation, has ever developed a evidence-based guideline for fatigue mitigation, despite the fact, which is key here, despite the fact that their understanding of fatigue, the dangers of fatigue, and their proactive action against fatigue in terms of developing fatigue risk management programs is much more mature than EMS is. Despite the fact of those actions and that pattern of behavior to address fatigue, they have not yet developed an evidence-based guideline. Our industry, EMS, is the first to do that. So I think in terms of a little bit of patting yourself on the back here as an industry, we should do that, and we should reference that frequently when surrounded by other shift worker occupations, because they haven't done that, and we did that. So we've made a significant contribution to fatigue risk management for all types of shift worker industries. A fatigue risk management plan should be a part of a safety management system. So a lot of organizations have a safety management system, but many don't. And if you do have one, it should be a part of that SMS. Science-based. The panel and also the researchers who worked on this just provided the information to make those programs science-based. Focus on specific outcomes, like maybe your outcome of interest is safety or job satisfaction. Very flexible. You may as an organization's leader, and you may be in the formative education phase, if you're teaching the future leaders of EMS organizations and management classes, for example, here's a key thing to teach them. They need to be flexible in how they develop their policies regarding fatigue risk management. They may decide to adopt 3 of the recommendations over a year, and after the 1-year period, not see the impact they had so desired to see, and they need to modify it. Flexibility, having that flexibility is important because you don't want to be too rigid. You may need to make some changes in terms of how you implement some of these recommendations. And the leadership needs to know that. All stakeholders need to be a part of the process and responsible, from the top management down to the frontline crew members. They all need to feel a sense of responsibility in terms of the process and the policies. Again, it's a shared responsibility between the employers and the employees. If it comes from the top down only, and the employees were not involved in the process or the policy making, then the program is at risk of failing. Summary. Everything you need to know is available in a series of publications, a supplemental issue published in Pre-Hospital Emergency Care. It's free. All the articles are free. 15 total, or actually there are 16, but the 15 important ones are available free. You can access them via the journal website, or you can go to emsfatigue.org. There's also a guidebook that we have still under review at NHTSA. It should be available soon, hopefully, fingers crossed soon, because we submitted it back in January. Available to anyone who wants to view it as sort of a template, a Cliff Note version, if you will, on developing a fatigue risk management program in-house. And hopefully that'll be available soon. Again, it's a 3-phase project. We're approaching phase 2. We're actually in the middle of gearing up for phase 2, where we intend to test one of the recommendations in an experimental study. Now I'm going to stop here so that we have time for questions. We got about 10 minutes or so. If you choose to have a question later, or you don't want to ask in this venue, please email me. My email is right here, pdp3@pitt.edu. Happy to take your questions via email or now.
All right, thank you very much, Daniel. I'll go through my spiel, and then we'll take any questions at the end. So once again, thank you for joining us for today's NAEMSE webinar. If you want to reference this webinar at any time, it will be uploaded to the NAEMSE website. Our next webinar will be held on July 18th at 12 p.m. Eastern. Registration is now open on the NAEMSE website. And other than that, let me see if we have any questions here, and then we'll wrap things up. All right, we have one question from Edward. With all the evidence-based data, especially within EMS, looks like a little spelling error here. How come more regulations haven't been instituted?
So a failure to act on the recommendations. That's, I think you're going to find that in a lot of different industries, not just EMS. You know, we're still, you know, this phrase has been used before. We're sort of new to the block in healthcare, and also in terms of in reference to other industries like aviation, the transportation. And even in those industries, there are recommendations that have been put out there and nobody has acted on them, or at least they're slow to act. You know, we hope that the visibility of this issue stimulates states, regions, and local organizations to act, because this is a huge problem. And as you saw from that video and some of those news media reports, that this is a life and death situation. You know, you have to act if you want to see positive change. And one of the areas I think the educators can have a very, very positive impact is if you incorporate the importance of sleep health and fatigue recognition and management of fatigue based off of evidence-based guidelines as a part of your formative education process. I think you can have probably potentially the biggest impact downstream when they get out of the education process and go into the organizations. They expect or demand that the organization address fatigue based off of the recommendations or based off of guidelines. To me, that is where the impact is going to happen on a lot of this information that has come out, dealing with fatigue, or even dealing with another aspect of clinical care, perhaps. But you guys, you educators, you potentially have really the key power here in making change happen regarding these recommendations.
All right. And then Robert Steep says, Dr. P, thanks for your work. We have another question from Gary Heigl. There are a number of fire departments going to 48-hour shifts with claims that they result in better rest and actually decrease fatigue issues. Thoughts?
Well, as I showed you on one of the previous slides, we don't have a lot of research out there that has examined these super long duration shifts. Now, it may be that in some organizations, crew members are able to get a lot of sleep, 6-7 hours per 24-hour period. And that may be the case. Now, I would argue that that's not restful sleep. I would argue that if we were able to put EEGs on people, we would probably find out that many of them are not going into the deeper stage sleep. They're probably hovering around stage 2, stage 3 sleep at the most. And so it's not really great sleep or restorative sleep. However, it is sleep. But we just don't know enough yet from the published evidence about these super long duration shifts on any outcome, whether it be a safety outcome, a job satisfaction outcome, a performance outcome. We simply just don't have any information, published evidence. Most of what you're hearing from people is really just hearsay or anecdote. So until we get more evidence published on these long duration shifts, I think we can't really come to any great conclusion in favor of or against these super long duration shifts. We just need more information.
All right. Kim McKenna says, thank you for this excellent presentation. We appreciate the rigorous research you conducted to help inform our decision-making on this important issue that impacts the safety of our personnel, our patients, and our community.
Oh, thank you, guys.
That looks about it for the questions.
Well, great. Well, thanks so much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it, and I hope it was informative.
Yeah, thank you very much, Daniel. And we'll wrap things up, and we'll see everybody next month. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks.